The morning began like any other, with the sun spilling golden light across the compound and the sounds of birds blending with the soft coos of her child. She had just begun preparing the day, tending to chores and whispering soothing words to her little one, unaware that this ordinary day would be shattered forever. The door creaked abruptly, and before she could react, figures appeared, moving swiftly and decisively. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized them. Relatives she had once trusted, now twisted by envy, greed, or resentment, moving with an intention that made her blood run cold. They did not speak kindly or pause to explain. With firm, almost violent hands, they lifted the child from her arms, ignoring her desperate pleas and frantic grasp. The baby wailed, tiny fists flailing, and she felt the world constrict around her in that moment. Every attempt to resist, every cry for help, was met with a cold indifference. She tried to follow, to grab, to bargain, but the figures were too strong, too organized, and she was too unprepared for such calculated cruelty. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, each beat echoing the fear and helplessness that threatened to consume her entirely. In the aftermath, the compound fell into an eerie stillness. The usual chatter of servants and neighbors seemed to retreat into silence, as if even the world itself had paused to mark the gravity of what had just occurred. She sank to the ground where she had last held her child, clutching at empty air, her body trembling and her mind spinning. Tears streamed down her face, not just from fear or grief, but from the shocking realization of how swiftly and completely her life had been upended. Every moment replayed in her mind, the soft smile of her child, the gentle cooing in the morning light, each one now transformed into a memory tinged with agony. She struggled to comprehend the cruelty, questioning how anyone could take away the most innocent and precious part of her life. Her husband's expression, once familiar and seemingly protective, now seemed foreign, or perhaps he had orchestrated the act himself. She could not tell. The jealousy and malice that had driven these actions weighed heavily on her, leaving her heart raw and aching. Questions swirled endlessly in her mind. Why her? Why this child? Was it envy, fear, or something darker that had prompted this violence? Each thought was heavier than the last, suffocating in its intensity, yet beneath the despair, a spark of determination began to flicker. Even in the midst of heartbreak, she felt an almost instinctive awareness that her child was not lost entirely, that there was still a thread connecting them, a hope to hold on to. Though shaken and weakened, she forced herself to rise, wiping tears from her face and pressing a hand to her heart to steady the frantic beats. The pain was immense, but so too was the bond that tied her to her child, a bond stronger than any cruelty, stronger than any envy. She knew that understanding, patience, and courage would be required to face what came next, and she allowed herself the briefest moment to mourn before steeling her resolve. The kidnapping had shattered her mourning, her peace, and her sense of safety, but it had not broken her spirit entirely, and that spirit would become the foundation for the struggle ahead. Nightfall brought a silence that was almost unbearable. The household settled into its usual rhythms, lamps flickered, and the soft rustle of curtains or the distant cooing of an owl was the only movement in the darkness. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her arms empty where her child should have been. The ache in her chest was constant, a hollow emptiness that no words could fill. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind through the eaves, made her heart leap, half expecting to see the tiny figure she had been forced to part with. Sleep was impossible, her mind too alive with longing, grief, and a quiet, simmering determination. As the hours stretched, she began to notice something subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Faint sounds, whispers, murmurs, or the softest coos, reached her ears, brushing against her consciousness like a delicate, invisible thread. At first, she questioned herself, unsure whether her exhaustion had created illusions, whether her grief had conjured these sounds out of desperation. But the whispers persisted, tender and deliberate, speaking in a cadence that made her pause, that made her feel as though someone, or something, was reaching across the distance specifically to her. The sounds were intimate, personal. They carried warmth and familiarity, rhythms that mirrored the gentle breaths of her child and the tiny coos she had known so well. Each whisper brought a mixture of comfort and torment, a reminder that her child existed somewhere beyond her reach and a sting of frustration that she could not immediately respond. Yet within the murmurs, there was a sense of presence, an undeniable feeling that the bond between mother and child had not been severed. The connection remained, fragile yet persistent, threading through the darkness like a lifeline. She began to listen with intent, leaning forward in her bed, holding her breath, straining to catch every syllable, every sigh that might carry meaning. Occasionally, words seemed to form, tiny fragments that could almost be understood. A plea, a name, a soft sound of recognition. She held onto each one, memorizing the tone, the cadence, the subtle pauses. Her heart, so heavy with grief, felt a flicker of hope ignite. Perhaps her child was not simply lost or in danger but attempting to communicate, to guide her, to let her know that someone was looking out for them both. The nights passed with this delicate ritual of listening, waiting, and interpreting. The quiet hours became a strange mixture of fear, anticipation, and connection. Each whisper, each soft sound, reminded her that she was not alone in her vigil, that her child's presence lingered despite the cruelty that had taken them away. Her mind, sharp despite exhaustion, began to notice patterns, small consistencies in timing and intonation, as if her child, or a protective force, was deliberately sending messages she was meant to hear. In the enveloping darkness, amid sorrow and longing, these whispers became both her guide and her anchor, shaping her resolve to act, to endure, and to find her child no matter what trials lay ahead. The nights continued in their quiet, oppressive way, but gradually, a subtle change began to unfold. It started in her dreams, those fleeting moments when the world seemed pliable and the rules of reality blurred. In those dreams, faint words formed, coherent enough to grab her attention and impossible to ignore. At first, she dismissed them as echoes of her desperate mind, conjured from the pain and longing she had carried since the day her child was taken. But the repetition, the clarity, and the insistence of the words told her otherwise. This was not mere fantasy, it was a message deliberately sent, a thread reaching across the distance separating her from her child. The phrases were simple but profound. They repeated with minor variations, sometimes at the very edge of consciousness, sometimes forming the center of her focus. She heard hints, names, directions, a rhythm of sounds that seemed coded yet purposeful. There was the soft, unmistakable utterance of her child's name, whispered in a tone that tugged at her heart with equal parts tenderness and urgency. Mixed with that were fragments of guidance, subtle clues about where the child might be, who might be caring for them, and who had taken them in the first place. The messages were cryptic yet tangible, filling her with a sense of direction that had been absent for days. Each time she awoke, drenched in sweat or clutching the sheets, her mind raced with interpretation. She replayed the phrases over and over, trying to connect the words to people, places, and events she already knew. The messages were both exhilarating and terrifying. Hope surged in her chest, a light breaking through the darkness that had enveloped her since the child's disappearance. But fear was never far behind. If these whispers were real, they meant that danger was also real, that someone had taken her child for a reason, and that acting too hastily could risk everything. During the waking hours, she began noticing subtle confirmations of what she had heard in the night. Small hints in her environment, a misplaced object, a peculiar pattern in the household's routine, the timing of certain visitors, echoed the messages from her dreams. It became clear that the whispers were not abstract. They were tethered to reality, offering actionable guidance if only she could decode them correctly. She felt an increasing sense of urgency, a pressure to remain alert, to remain attentive, and to trust the instincts that the messages were awakening within her. As the nights went on, the messages grew more distinct, forming a fragile thread of communication that connected her to her child. They hinted not only at location but at a network of protectors or allies who were quietly keeping the child safe, ensuring that harm would not come. She understood that her role was not only to follow these clues but to act with patience and intelligence, carefully navigating the dangers that lurked in the shadows. The words were a lifeline, a map woven in whispers, bridging the distance created by cruelty and deception. Hope and fear mingled in a strange balance. Each message was a promise and a warning, a source of strength and a call to vigilance. She knew that one misstep could jeopardize everything, yet the thought that her child was alive, aware, and somehow reaching out to her filled her heart with a determination that eclipsed despair. The first message had arrived, fragile yet undeniable, and with it came the first flicker of a plan, the first spark of courage, and the first step toward reclaiming what had been taken from her. As the days passed, her alertness sharpened, attuned to every detail around the house. The household, which had once seemed familiar and predictable, now appeared layered with subtle hints, small signals that had previously gone unnoticed. Her senses became hyper-aware of objects slightly out of place, of whispers too soft to belong to anyone she could see, and of patterns in the daily routines that, at first, seemed ordinary but slowly revealed themselves as deliberate. It was as though the environment itself was trying to speak to her, to guide her toward the truth of her child's circumstances. It began with small, almost imperceptible objects. A toy left on a window ledge where it had no reason to be. A ribbon tucked under a chair that she hadn't placed there. A tiny footprint on the dusted floor that seemed freshly made despite the presence of cleaning staff. Each of these signs was fleeting, easily dismissed, yet she could feel their intentionality. They were too deliberate to be accidents, too precise to be overlooked. Slowly, a pattern emerged. These were not random occurrences. Someone, her child or a guardian working in secret, was leaving breadcrumbs, communicating silently with a mother desperate for connection. She also began noticing sounds that were too consistent to be coincidence. A soft rustle behind doors, the gentle tap of footsteps in empty corridors, and faint murmurs that almost resembled the tone of her child's voice, each occurring at particular times of day. She started recording these moments mentally, cataloging the sounds and their timing, recognizing that they were messages layered into the mundane rhythm of daily life. Even when she could not clearly discern words, the tone, the cadence, and the location of the sounds conveyed meaning, a code she instinctively began to understand. The signs extended to subtle movements around the home. Servants or trusted allies, perhaps directed by the hidden protectors, would occasionally place objects or make gestures that seemed casual but carried significance. A bowl left in a specific corner, a candle lit in a seemingly arbitrary location, or a window slightly ajar, all became components of a quiet language she was learning to read. She realized that her household had become a canvas for communication, painted with clues only she could understand because only she was paying the attention needed to notice them. With each discovery, a clearer picture of her child's situation began to emerge. She understood where the baby was being cared for, who was involved in keeping the child safe, and which members of the household were complicit in the theft versus those quietly working to protect her child. These signs were never blatant. They were designed to avoid detection, to communicate in whispers and gestures, rather than overt declarations. She marveled at the ingenuity behind them, recognizing the care and subtlety employed to preserve her child's safety while giving her hope. Her confidence grew as the signs accumulated, each one reinforcing the reality that her child was alive and being watched over. She began planning her movements more strategically, guided by these clues. A misplaced object here or a fleeting sound there could inform her approach, hinting at the right time to act, the safest path to follow, and the steps necessary to reclaim her child. The messages were like threads of light woven into the darkness of her suffering, connecting her to the living reality of her child, even in the midst of uncertainty and danger. Through these subtle signs, she also learned patience and observation. Every hint, every fragment of evidence required careful interpretation, demanding a steady mind and a keen eye. Her anguish, while profound, became coupled with focus and determination, transforming the household into a landscape of intelligence, resilience, and maternal vigilance. The signs were more than communication. They were proof that she was not alone, that there were forces working quietly on her behalf, and that every small detail mattered in the unfolding story of reunion. Each day, as she pieced together these hints, a sense of empowerment replaced despair. The household, once a place of confinement and cruelty, had become a secret network of guidance, offering her glimpses into her child's world. Every object, sound, and subtle motion was a testament to the care taken to protect her child and the careful orchestration required to convey this truth to her without endangering anyone. Through observation, patience, and relentless attention, she began to chart a path toward reclaiming her child, guided by the delicate, deliberate signs woven throughout the home. The days of silent vigilance and careful observation had prepared her for this moment. She had seen the subtle signs, heard the whispers in the night, and pieced together fragments of the story through patient attention. But there remained uncertainty, a nagging doubt about whether she had interpreted everything correctly. The notion of the child's safety, while comforting, also left her restless, desperate for confirmation. She needed to know definitively that the whispers, the glimmers, and the clues she had been following were not mere illusions of longing, but tangible evidence of protection and guidance from someone who truly understood her child's plight. It was in this state of cautious hope that she sought out a trusted confidant. This person could be an elder who had long served the family, a neighbor with intimate knowledge of the household's comings and goings, or a loyal servant whose devotion had been quietly consistent over the years. Whoever they were, they carried credibility, experience, and, most importantly, discretion. She approached carefully, choosing the moment when others were least likely to overhear, and spoke in tones hushed with both urgency and reverence. Her heart raced as she recounted the events. The kidnapping, the nightly whispers, the signs she had painstakingly observed, and the small patterns she had begun to decipher. The confidant listened intently, eyes narrowing thoughtfully, hands folded in measured contemplation. For a long moment, there was silence, the weight of their scrutiny pressing upon her. Then, slowly, a subtle nod acknowledged her understanding, and a soft, knowing smile curved across the elder's face. They began to speak, revealing a network of hidden protectors who had been orchestrating the child's safety from the shadows. It was a web of careful planning, involving a small circle of trusted allies who moved discreetly, ensuring that no harm would come to the baby and that the child remained beyond the reach of jealous relatives, rivals, or anyone who sought to manipulate her through separation. The confidant explained how the network operated. Messages and signs had been intentionally left for her, designed to be discovered only by a mother patient and observant enough to notice them. The whispers she had heard in the quiet hours of the night were not hallucinations but deliberate communications, transmitted through subtle cues, gentle sounds, and patterns within the household. Every glint of a misplaced object, every carefully staged noise, had been crafted to provide reassurance, guidance, and direction. The confidant emphasized that these measures were necessary, as those who had taken the child remained vigilant and unaware of the hidden guardian's careful interventions. As the story unfolded, a sense of clarity and relief washed over her. She learned of the child's temporary guardians, trusted neighbors, distant relatives, or even mentors who had once guided her own path. Each protector had a distinct role, ensuring that the baby received care, nourishment, and love while remaining hidden from the eyes of those who would exploit the situation. The confidant explained how timing, secrecy, and trust had been meticulously balanced to maintain the child's safety while subtly sending reassurance to her mother. She absorbed every detail with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Her prior observations, once filled with uncertainty and anxious speculation, suddenly aligned with a broader picture of intentional protection. The whispers that had drawn her attention, the objects that had seemed misplaced, the subtle gestures she had noticed, all were pieces of a complex puzzle, now illuminated with purpose and precision. For the first time she felt a profound sense of empowerment, knowing that her child had not been abandoned, that forces beyond her immediate awareness were working in concert to ensure the child's survival and well-being. The confidant also imparted guidance for the next steps. They outlined the safest approach to gradually reclaim contact with her child, stressing patience, discretion, and strategic planning. Every action had to be deliberate, every movement calculated to avoid alerting those who had sought to control her through separation. She was advised to continue observing, interpreting, and decoding the subtle signs while preparing herself mentally and emotionally for the eventual reunion. The confidant's experience lent both legitimacy and structure to the fragments of understanding she had already gained. As she left the confidant's presence, a renewed determination took root. The weight of fear and uncertainty, once heavy and oppressive, was now tempered by knowledge, guidance, and an actionable plan. She understood that the network protecting her child was reliable, that the whispers and signs had real meaning, and that the careful orchestration around her was evidence of both the child's safety and the trust placed in her perceptiveness. Nightfall, which had previously brought anxious listening and tentative hope, now became a time of reflection and strategy. She replayed the confidant's words, committing every detail to memory, analyzing how the information aligned with what she had already observed. The delicate network of guardians, the careful placement of messages, and the subtle communications had transformed the household from a place of despair and uncertainty into a landscape of guidance and opportunity. With this confirmation, she could now act with purpose and confidence, understanding that the child's safety was ensured and that every whisper, every subtle sign, had been a bridge connecting her to her baby. The trusted confidant had revealed the true scope of protection, provided clarity amidst chaos, and given her the assurance necessary to continue her journey toward reunion. Empowered by this knowledge, she prepared to take the next steps, guided by observation, intelligence, and the unwavering bond between mother and child. As the days progressed, the clarity she had gained from observing signs in the household and consulting the trusted confidant allowed her to see patterns that had previously eluded her. The whispers of her child, once faint and almost dreamlike, became sharper, carrying a weight of urgency and caution that she could no longer ignore. Through these subtle communications, she began to understand that the forces behind her child's abduction were not ordinary adversaries. They were cunning, ruthless, and driven by motivations that extended beyond petty cruelty. Every decision they had made, every action to hide and control her child, reflected intelligence, resourcefulness, and an underlying fear that she might reclaim her rightful place. The whispered messages revealed more than just the child's presence. They contained guidance, small fragments of strategy, and warnings that allowed her to gauge the true danger she faced. It became evident that the abductors were motivated by a mix of greed, jealousy, and fear. Some sought to manipulate her through the child, hoping to control her behavior or extract concessions. Others were motivated by envy, wishing to claim a position of influence, property, or legacy that rightly belonged to her or her family. The child's messages, though gentle and subtle, warned her that these were not people to be underestimated. Their cunning extended to the household itself, which had become a carefully controlled environment, designed to obscure her knowledge and slow her progress. She began to notice signs of the abductor's reach in subtle ways. A shadow moving too deliberately through the courtyard, a servant acting unusually nervous, or messages she intercepted that seemed carefully disguised as mundane conversation, all hinted at vigilance and control. It was as if every corner of the environment had been anticipated by those who had removed her child, reinforcing the need for extreme caution in her own movements. The child's whispers now seemed to carry a dual purpose, both reassurance and instruction, guiding her toward safety while alerting her to threats that could easily be overlooked by an untrained observer. The danger was not merely physical but psychological. The abductors had created a network of fear and intimidation, designed to destabilize her mentally, make her second-guess every move and cultivate hesitation. They relied on secrecy, misdirection, and careful observation of her responses. Recognizing this, she realized that a direct confrontation without preparation would be catastrophic. Every step forward required patience, precision, and an understanding of both the abductor's methods and the protective guidance the child was providing. The child's whispers served as a bridge between her and the hidden network of allies already ensuring safety. They conveyed subtle instructions such as the best paths to move through the household undetected, signals that indicated when it was safe to approach certain areas, and alerts to times when the abductor's attention might be elsewhere. Each warning required careful interpretation, teaching her to read between the lines, discern intention from circumstance, and act with both courage and caution. The child's voice, though soft and ethereal, became a lifeline, grounding her strategy in instinctual awareness and emotional connection. This growing understanding of hidden danger shifted her approach entirely. She could no longer rely solely on observation and patience. She had to anticipate threats, plan contingencies, and maintain a mental map of both her enemies and allies. She realized that while the abductors were dangerous, they were not infallible, and the child's guidance provided her with the advantage necessary to navigate the perilous situation. By the end of this period of insight, she had transformed her fear into strategy. The whispers had not only confirmed the presence of danger but had also empowered her to confront it intelligently. She recognized that the abductor's strength lay in secrecy and intimidation, while her own strength lay in knowledge, patience, and the subtle guidance flowing from the child. Each warning and piece of advice whispered through the night prepared her for the next stage, approaching the situation safely, reclaiming her child, and ensuring that the forces that had tried to dominate her would ultimately be exposed and overcome. After days of listening, observing, and piecing together the subtle signals from her child's whispers, she began to see a path forward. The initial haze of despair and fear that had clouded her mind since the kidnapping was replaced by a sharp focus, a clarity of purpose that centered entirely on one goal: reclaiming her child. Each whispered word, each subtle hint, acted like a thread in a tapestry she was now weaving in her mind, a detailed plan that required patience, intelligence, and careful timing. She understood that any misstep could endanger the child, alert the abductors, or ruin the network of protective allies that had been working in secret to shield them both. She started by mapping out what she knew. The whispers had indicated the general location of the child, pointing towards safe zones, temporary hiding places, and the timing of the abductor's movements. She cross-referenced these with her observations of the household and its surroundings, the layout of rooms, courtyards, paths through the village, and the patterns of those who had taken her child. Every detail mattered: the placement of doors, the presence of watchful neighbors, the times when the abductors were least vigilant. By combining this information, she began to visualize the safest approach, identifying where she could move unseen, where she could pause without risk, and where the child might be most vulnerable to discovery. The strategy she developed was multi-layered. First, she needed to confirm the child's safety without alarming the abductors. For this, she relied on indirect observation and the child's subtle guidance: soft knocks, faint sounds, and whispered messages that indicated the child was unharmed and alert to her approach. She planned small tests, minor movements designed to provoke a reaction, which would confirm the child's presence and the accuracy of the guidance she had been receiving. Each test was carefully considered. Nothing was done impulsively. Her patience was a weapon as sharp as any dagger, and she wielded it with precision. Next, she accounted for potential obstacles. The abductors were cunning, capable of manipulating their environment and predicting the actions of those who might oppose them. She analyzed their patterns, the moments when they were distracted, the areas they considered secure, and the weaknesses in their vigilance. She anticipated their likely responses to any intrusion, preparing contingencies for each scenario. Her mind became a chessboard, with pieces representing herself, the child, the abductors, and the hidden allies. Every move was planned not just for immediate impact but for its effect on the broader strategy, ensuring that she maintained control over the unfolding situation. Communication with her hidden allies became an essential part of the plan. She coordinated subtle signals, knocks, glances, and objects left in specific locations, to synchronize actions and create diversions without revealing her intentions. These allies, though few, were trusted implicitly, and their support allowed her to expand the scope of her plans safely. She realized that the power of collaboration, when combined with the child's whispered guidance, was a force greater than the abductor's cunning or the household's manipulations. She also prepared herself mentally and emotionally. The plan required her to act with courage under pressure, to make rapid decisions in response to unpredictable circumstances, and to remain calm in the face of fear. She practiced restraint, rehearsing the steps she would take, imagining the encounters with the abductors, and visualizing the moment when she would finally reach her child. Her preparation was exhaustive. She considered every detail, rehearsed every possible scenario, and committed each step to memory. Timing was critical. She chose the night for her approach, knowing that darkness would provide concealment, while familiar sounds of the household would mask her movements. She synchronized her actions with the natural rhythm of the environment, the barking of distant dogs, the lull of the wind through trees, and the soft stirrings of nocturnal creatures. Even the smallest environmental detail was integrated into her strategy, as any deviation from plan could alert the abductors to her presence. The whispers of her child continued to guide her, offering reassurance and subtle corrections. At times she paused to listen intently, letting the messages flow into her awareness, adjusting her plan in real time. Each instruction was carefully interpreted, ensuring that she did not misread signals or act prematurely. The child's guidance was precise, a mixture of intuition and communication that allowed her to move forward with confidence despite the danger surrounding them. By the end of her preparation, the plan was complete, a sequence of measured steps that combined stealth, intelligence, patience, and the wisdom imparted by the whispers. She had anticipated obstacles, coordinated with allies, and prepared for every contingency. Most importantly, she had internalized the child's guidance, ensuring that her actions would be both safe and effective. In her mind, she rehearsed the path, the approach, and the eventual reunion, feeling a surge of determination that strengthened her resolve. The plan to reclaim her child was no longer just a hope, it was a calculated strategy, a roadmap to restore what had been taken, guided by intuition, patience, and the unbreakable bond between mother and child. With every detail meticulously considered, she was ready to act, confident that the steps she had laid out would lead her to success, safety, and ultimately the restoration of her family. She began observing the abductors with the caution of someone who knew a single misstep could cost everything. Every movement she made was deliberate, every glance measured, every breath controlled. She kept herself hidden in shadows, behind cracked doors, near corners where the dim light never reached. From these concealed spaces she watched them, studied them, until their routines unfolded before her like a pattern woven into fabric. She realized quickly that people who used cruelty to exert power often left cracks in their armor, and she was determined to find every single one. At dawn, she noticed the first routine. One of the abductors always left to fetch water, leaving the others distracted with household tasks. During midday, they grew lazy after eating, often arguing with each other or gossiping loudly enough for her to gather small clues about their mindset. At night, they grew restless, paranoid, and suspicious, yet even then they had moments of tiredness and sloppiness. She noted how often they checked the child's hiding place, who guarded it at which times, and which guards seemed the most easily manipulated by fear or distraction. She watched their hands, their postures, their habits. One of them always scratched his beard when lying. Another grew jittery when left alone with the child, as though guilt gnawed at him. A third, perhaps the most dangerous, acted indifferent, but she caught the way his eyes darted nervously whenever someone mentioned the child's fate. These small observations became vital pieces in her strategy, showing her where the abductor's strength weakened and where their cruelty stemmed from insecurity rather than true power. Most important of all, she focused on glimpses of her child. Even if the abductors believed they had hidden the little one well, they underestimated a mother's perception. She saw the way the cloth covering the entrance to the concealed room moved slightly during certain hours, revealing that the child was awake. She noticed a faint shadow, tiny, soft, moving gently across the floor. She caught moments when the abductors whispered among themselves about the child crying softly or refusing to sleep. These details reassured her that the child was conscious, responsive, and still able to send whispers at night. She paid attention to how they treated the child too. Despite the cruelty of kidnapping, she realized they were careful not to harm the infant physically, likely because they needed the child alive for whatever twisted motive drove them. This knowledge eased some of her fear and allowed her to refine her plan without the urgency of panic. She observed how often they checked on the child, how they transported food or water to the hidden area, and where they kept keys, tools, or objects that she might use to her advantage. As she watched, she also identified the safest routes, corridors, corners, and silent pathways where her footsteps would be muffled by old rugs or worn-out floors. She memorized the creaks in the wood, the echoes in certain rooms, and the areas where she needed to hold her breath to avoid detection. She studied the architecture as much as the people, recognizing that her environment would be her ally if she understood it well enough. Every observation strengthened her confidence. Every whispered clue from her child intertwined with what she learned silently. By the time she completed her surveillance, she no longer felt powerless. Instead, she felt prepared, armed with knowledge that the abductors never suspected she possessed. She had studied them deeply, seeing what they could not hide and hearing what they failed to silence. And now, with their routines exposed and their weaknesses uncovered, she knew her plan would not simply be an attempt. It would be a rescue destined to succeed. She moved with deliberate care, each step measured and silent, every breath controlled as though the very air might betray her presence. The clues she had gathered from days of observation and the gentle whispers of her child guided her through the labyrinth of the abductor's stronghold. Shadows became her allies, the creaks of the floorboards mere signals to pause or adjust her movements. She imagined the child waiting quietly, sensing her approach in the distance, their whispers growing ever so faintly like a thread pulling her closer. Every instinct, every ounce of patience, had led her to this moment, and she understood that the reunion depended not on haste but precision. Her first obstacle was the outer gate, patrolled lightly at this hour as she had observed. Using a discarded piece of cloth, she muffled her footfalls and approached from the side that the abductors considered untraversable, where thorn bushes created a natural barrier they believed was impenetrable. She bent low, moving through the undergrowth like a shadow herself, careful to avoid the dry twigs that could betray her path with a single snap. The whispers guided her toward the faint sound of a lullaby, a tiny murmur of recognition that confirmed she was on the right path. Once past the gate, she encountered the first interior obstacle, a locked door that barred direct access to the child's hidden room. She remembered the small set of keys she had glimpsed during her days of observation, noticing that one of the abductors always left it dangling on a nail just out of reach but visible. Timing her approach with the moment he stepped away for water, she stretched carefully, retrieved the key, and unlocked the door silently. Her heart raced, not from fear but anticipation, each second stretching into eternity as she held the brass key between trembling fingers. Inside, dim light filtered through a small window, illuminating the path to a small cot tucked in the corner, draped in a worn cloth. She froze momentarily, observing the abductor's movements as she had rehearsed countless times in her mind. The whispers grew stronger, urging patience, whispering directions for the final stretch. She edged closer, mindful of the sounds of breathing, footsteps, and subtle shifts in the fabric that indicated the child's position. Every detail she had memorized from her surveillance guided her. The placement of crates, the position of a chair that could block a line of sight, and the timing of her own steps to coincide with a lull in activity outside the room. As she reached the cot, she extended her hand slowly, careful not to startle the child or alert the abductors to any sudden movement. The child's whispers mingled with the soft rustling of cloth, signaling recognition and trust. She spoke softly, her voice a gentle anchor in the tense silence, and felt the tiny hands reach for her fingers, wrapping around them with instinctive trust. Relief surged through her, yet she remained composed. The final steps were still critical. The challenge was not only to reunite but to retreat safely. She had anticipated this in her plan, noting a narrow, concealed path that would take them away from the abductors' usual patrols. Cradling her child carefully, she retraced her steps, mindful of the dry twigs and shifting shadows, listening for the faintest indication of discovery. The whispers guided her like a lantern in darkness, ensuring that each careful step maintained the fragile balance between caution and urgency. Halfway through, a soft sound alerted her to a sudden movement. A guard had deviated from the usual path. Instinct took over. She pressed herself and the child against the wall, holding her breath as the figure passed. The whispers reassured her that the child was still calm, sensing no danger. She moved again once the sound faded, every muscle taut with concentration, every heartbeat in sync with the child's quiet murmurs. Emerging finally into the open air, she felt the night wind on her face, the distant cries of nocturnal creatures a soft accompaniment to her cautious progress. The path to safety stretched ahead, yet she moved confidently, knowing she had anticipated every challenge. The abductors had been careful, but they could not account for her patience, her observation, and the unwavering guidance of her child's whispers. By the time she reached the hidden grove where allies waited, she was physically exhausted but emotionally triumphant. Every calculated step, every quiet pause, every use of intelligence and intuition had brought her here. She held her child close, feeling the warmth, the life, and the trust that had guided her all these days. The reunion was complete, not by chance, but by careful planning, courage, and the sacred bond between mother and child that no cruelty, distance, or darkness could sever. Her eyes met those of the child, their whispers now transformed into coos of recognition and relief, a testament to the journey they had endured together. She had navigated the dangers, the obstacles, and the deceit, and emerged victorious, guided by patience, observation, and love. She felt the whispers grow clearer as she crept closer to the hidden compound, each soft sound threading through the night like a guide only she could hear. Her heart pounded, not only from fear but from the strange familiarity of the voice, tiny, breathy, and warm, as if her baby were pressed right against her ear. The rustling of leaves seemed to echo the murmurs, carrying fragments of meaning she had never noticed before. Every step forward made the truth sharpen, unraveling mysteries she had ignored in her desperation. The baby wasn't just calling her. The baby was trying to show her what had been happening behind her back long before the abduction. As she approached the rear entrance, a wave of realization washed over her. The whispers weren't just memories or dreams. Her child had been aware in ways no infant should be. She paused in the shadows, listening, her breath trembling. A small, gentle hum wrapped around her mind, revealing faces she had trusted for years, faces that had stood beside her during celebrations, arguments, and grief. People who had reached out to hold her child with smiles too wide, eyes too calculating. The whispers painted their intentions with chilling clarity, and she saw the truth. This kidnapping hadn't been impulsive or emotional. It had been planned. Prepared. Her baby's soft voice guided her memories back to the days before the disappearance. She remembered how her husband's sister lingered too long near the crib, how her cousin's wife offered to take the baby for a walk, with a tone too sweet to be real. She remembered how one of the servants shut the door quickly one evening when she walked by, pretending not to notice her sudden presence. Those little moments she had brushed aside now rose like dark smoke filling her lungs. But the whispers didn't stop at these revelations, they pushed deeper. A warmth spread over her as she felt the presence of another voice, faint but comforting, layered beneath her child's. It belonged to the one person she had almost overlooked in her grief, the old neighbor, Amina, who had always brought herbs, advice, or a gentle smile whenever she felt overwhelmed. The whispers showed scenes she had never seen. Amina standing by the gate the night the baby was taken, blocking one of the abductors from leaving until she could slip a charm into the baby's blanket. A charm meant to help the child's spirit speak when in danger. Amina had known something was coming long before anyone else did. She had been trying to protect them both. The ground beneath her feet felt lighter as she absorbed the truth. Her child had not been alone. Her baby had been watched over by unseen hands, guided by spirits awakened by the charm. The whispers grew slow and steady, revealing the final, cruel twist in the plot. The one person she had trusted the most had orchestrated everything. Her own husband. The realization hit her with enough force to make her stumble. His calm explanations, his comforting words, his grief when the baby vanished, it had all been a performance. He wanted control, power, or revenge for something she had never fully understood. Now the whispers filled in the gaps. He believed the child did not belong to him. Someone had poisoned his mind, feeding him lies that drove him into jealousy and madness. The truth whispered through her bones. He had allowed others to take the child, thinking he was saving himself from humiliation. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the baby had inherited something rare, an ancient sensitivity passed down through her bloodline. A gift of spiritual hearing, a connection to voices beyond the physical. That gift was what had guided her back, what had kept the child safe, and what had revealed the entire scheme. Tears blurred her vision as she crouched behind a broken wall, her chest tightening with both sorrow and strength. The child's voice changed, becoming clearer, no longer fragmented. It wasn't fear she heard, it was trust. It told her she was close, that the danger was real, but so was the protection surrounding them. The baby revealed who had held them gently, who had fed them when others turned away. A distant cousin, pressured into joining the plan but secretly trying to shield the child from harm. Every truth, every whispered confession, wove together into a powerful force inside her. She no longer felt like a broken mother crawling toward a stolen child. She felt like someone chosen, someone guided, someone meant to break this cycle of jealousy and cruelty that had plagued her family for generations. The final whisper settled in her heart like fire. Once she reclaimed her child, nothing would ever be the same. And she was ready. She stepped into the clearing with careful purpose, her heart steady despite the rage and fear that churned beneath her skin. The abductors had gathered, unaware that the quiet mother they had dismissed was no longer powerless. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle whisper of the wind seemed to confirm that the moment of reckoning had arrived. She held her child close, feeling the tiny hands clutching her fingers, their trust anchoring her resolve. The whispers that had guided her all these nights now pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, providing clarity and courage. She began calmly, her voice measured but sharp, recounting the facts she had meticulously gathered, the timing of the abduction, the suspicious behavior she had observed, and the protective measures the child had received from those who truly cared. She spoke without accusation at first, letting the weight of evidence speak for itself, allowing the abductors to feel the suffocating precision of her knowledge. Every misstep, every false alibi they had woven unraveled under her careful narration. The abductors tried to interrupt, their voices sharp with indignation and fear, but she anticipated this. She held up the small item she had collected, the blanket with the protective charm, notes left in secret, and the tiny traces of the child's location. Each item was a testament to the truth, and with every object presented, their deception became more apparent to the gathered witnesses. Even the bravest among them faltered, glances exchanged in silent panic. Her strategy was not only to reclaim her child but to ensure that the motives and manipulations behind the abduction were laid bare. She spoke of the jealousy, the greed, and the lies that had driven these people to take the child, painting a clear picture of how trust had been violated and innocence threatened. The villagers who had once admired or feared the abductors now saw the reality, the cruelty that had been hidden in plain sight. The final moment came when she turned fully to face the ringleaders, her voice unwavering. She demanded the release of her child, stating firmly that any resistance would only cement their guilt in the eyes of all who had gathered. For the first time, the abductors saw her not as a frightened mother, but as a force guided by intelligence, courage, and a profound connection to her child. One by one they faltered. Some tried feeble excuses, others fell silent, unable to maintain the facade of innocence. The child's tiny whispers, once soft and hidden, now seemed to amplify the truth, echoing in the ears of all present, a subtle but undeniable affirmation of her bond and the justice she pursued. Finally she reclaimed her child fully, holding them close, and in that embrace, the power of truth and love became evident to everyone watching. The abductors' motives were exposed, their plans unraveled, and the household's fragile illusions shattered. She had not only rescued her child but also asserted her authority, intelligence, and resilience, leaving no room for doubt. Deception could not withstand courage guided by love and wisdom.